I'm a kid from the 90s. Well, I was born in the 80s, in the early 80s. I was born in late 1982. But that makes me a kid of the 90s in terms of pop culture, I guess. Because I, was 10 in 1992. And one could say the 90s really started around 1992, 1993. Before that, it was still like the spirit of the 80s, but in the early 90s, some musical revolutions took place. Grunge in America, Britpop in England, certain electronic styles, hip hop got bigger. So, one could say the 90s really started around 1992, 1993. Besides electronic music, there wasn't really much innovation. It was the first real retro decade, one could say. There were some retro trends in the 80s as well, with a revival of 50s music. But in the 90s, really, guitar music was the first time guitar music mostly looked back, on 60s and 70s stuff. But still, there was great music. And what makes the 90s also cool is, I think, that they don't really have an identity. The 80s, there's always the 80s sound, 70s rock, 60s music. Those are really, you could put them more into a box. But the 90s were more an anything goes decade. So I think that makes a fun video, talking about from someone who was there at the time, talking about my top 50 favorite 1990s albums. And it will be a very varied list with different kinds of musical styles. And the ranking, as always with rankings, it's difficult to say why you rank something like top 10 album and something doesn't even make the top 50. I tried to make it, to reflect the spirit of the 90s, to put in records from all kinds of different genres. I wanted to make this, very colorful and varied, because that's, like I said, that's what the 90s meant to me. So now, without much further ado, these are my top 50 albums from the 1990s. Number 50 is a tie. It's two albums, because by doing that I can shoehorn in one more album. I thought, on the one hand, it's Pinkerton by Weezer, my favorite Weezer album, one of, in my opinion, two good albums they did. Their debut album was also quite good. And it's tied with probably the most controversial pick on the complete list, Be Here Now by Oasis. Lots of things could be said about this, why this is not a great album and why this was a massive failure. But this somehow symbolizes, the 90s to me. It brings back lots of memories. It was such a big event when that album came out, and initially everybody loved it, including me. And it took a few months until it dawned on us, Oasis fans and the rest, and non-Oasis fans, I suppose, as well, that it's probably not the big masterpiece. Number 49 is a vinyl. I'm not the biggest hip-hop fan, but I think in the 90s, in my opinion, hip-hop was the best. My favorite hip-hop is from the 90s. Enter the Wu-Tang by Wu-Tang Clan. Great album. Number 48 is by a French act called Cassius, and the album is called 1999. It was also released in 1999. This is like a French house, very danceable, disco kind of record. Electronic music, as I said in the intro, was big in the 90s. This is one of my favorite electronic albums from that period. If you like Daft Punk, you may enjoy that as well. Number 47, again hip-hop. Jazz Mathes with Volume 1. This is interesting. This was, I think, at the beginning of the 90s, 1993. This was like trying to mix jazz music with hip-hop. There's real drums, real bass, real instruments, and rapping on there. Very interesting and very, very colorful album, I would say. Next one, 46, Stanley Road by Paul Weller, my favorite solo album by Paul Weller. I would say I prefer one or two Style Council albums, but from the solo albums, and especially from the 90s albums, this is his magnum opus, I would say. Great album with, classics, Paul Weller classics like The Changing Man, You Do Something to Me. I like Whirlpool's End a lot. Noel Gallagher is also on one song, I think on I Walk on Gilded Splinters. 45, again, electronic music, trip hop as it was called, the Bristol sound from the mid-late 90s. This is Maxinque by Tricky. Many people think this is his best album, or maybe even the best trip hop album ever. We'll see if that applies for me as well. We'll see. Next one is 44, Erykah Badu, Baduism. That's like a modern, for 90s, modern 90s approach of R&B music, soul music. Very cool, very good record. 43 is, next to the Oasis, the first kind of Brit pop, or Welsh pop in this case, from Wales, Catatonia, International Velvet. There's even a song on that album where she, the singer, I think Cerys Matthews was her name, sings in Welsh language, which is very interesting. Plus great, great hits, Brit pop hits like Mulder & Scully and Road Rage. Great, underrated album, I would say. Underrated band at that time. 42 is again hip hop. The Roots, Things Fall Apart. That's a great song, and we had Erykah, great album. Song, I meant You Got Me. We've had Erykah Badu a couple of places ago. She sings on the song You Got Me, which was like the hit from that album, and that's one of the best songs of the 90s, I would say. Great soul with hip hop, and also like the Jazzmatazz record. This is a bit like hip hop, but with real musicians. But the Roots, of course, nowadays are very famous. I don't have to tell you much about the Roots, I guess. Next is again the Britpop era, 41, the second Supergrass album, and my favorite Supergrass album, In It For The Money. Great album. Highlights, I would say, are, it's just highlights, I would say. There aren't really bad songs on that album, but I enjoy You Can See Me and Sun Hits the Sky probably the most. Great hook lines, great energy. Next one, this is the album that the parents of 90s kids loved the most, so it wasn't maybe cool at that time for me. At that time I wouldn't have admitted that this is a very significant 90s record. Buena Vista Social Club, it's not really by one artist, it's it's a compilation compiled by Ry Cooder with musicians from Cuba. It was a very successful documentary, and the album is probably to this day the biggest world music kind of album ever, sold probably more than 10 million albums. It's more like the parents' choice, I would say. Next up, 39. This was difficult for me to decide on what to put as my favorite Neil Young album from the decade. There were so many great albums. I think they're all about the same in terms of quality. There are 3 or 4 others that are almost as good or as good as Mirrorball, the album he recorded with Pearl Jam. I'm the Ocean is on there, one of his best songs ever, I would say. But I have also to give an honourable mention to albums like Wrecked Glory, Sleeps With Angels. I really love Sleeps With Angels. Harvest Moon, of course. So, this could be any of those Neil Young albums. Next is again electronic music. Big Beat was the name of the genre. Prodigy, who were also more like jungle influenced, were the other big group. Propellerheads were also acts of that genre. But my favorite album and act of the genre are the Chemical Brothers. It sounds like Tomorrow Never Knows by the Beatles with a 90s jungle trip hop electronic twist on it. And Noel Gallagher sings on the very Tomorrow Never Knows like song Setting Sun, which I think was #1 hit in Britain in 1997. Great album. Next, again hip hop. lots of it. Is this really from the 90s? Oh, this is from 2000. So, okay, this disqualifies. This is Stankonia by Outkast. But that way, we can say that number 50 wasn't tied. Visa was 50 and Be Here Now was 49. So I disqualified this album from 2000. But anyway, a great hip hop album from Outkast. Next is 36. Now this is the first from really the early 90s. This must be from 1990. Yeah, 1990. The Lars, the only studio album by the Lars. Great melodic, folky album. This was like, this signaled the end of the 80s sound. Of the huge reverby drum sound. This is like get back to more natural kind of guitar music, and was in that sense very influential to the Britpop music, especially the northern English bands like Oasis. They're from Liverpool, the Lars, great band. Unfortunately, their only album. Next is one of 2 or 3 real pure pop albums on this list. I'm more an indie guy, one could say, but this was a big mainstream album and great. I also like great mainstream pop music. It's only very rare that something like that is really, that I really like something like that. But this is The Velvet Rope by Janet Jackson, her best album. Maybe better than any album her more famous brother ever made. Great album, The Velvet Rope by Janet Jackson. Next is number 34. This is Hardcore by Pulp. You could say it was released, I think, in early 1998. It was like the swan song of Britpop, the dark side of Britpop. After all the, the champagne, the cocaine, the parties, this was like coming down, like the hangover almost. But not, I personally, I enjoyed Different Class, the album before more on that later. But nevertheless, great dark Britpop album. Next is 33, another of those Britpop swan song albums, one of the last big Britpop albums released probably half a year before. This is Hardcore, The Verve, Urban Hymns, with the big hits like Bittersweet Symphony, Sonnet, The Drugs Don't Work, Lucky Man, but also the non-singles. There are really great songs like Weeping Willow, This Time, Velvet Morning. It's a brilliant album. Next is also a brilliant album, of course, again from the early 90s, Screamadelica by Primal Scream. This was like the beginning of, they're not from Manchester, so it's not a Manchester album. Manchester had that Manchester scene in the early 90s with bands like James, Stone Roses, Happy Mondays. But they're from Glasgow, but this is still a bit in that vein, in that ecstasy, taking ecstasy, going to raves, going to Ibiza, Mallorca, but mixed with, Rolling Stones, kind of like Rolling Stones guitar, blues rock. So very strange mixture, but it worked. It worked on that album. Number 31, an album that I personally am not a big fan of, but I can see its importance, so that's why it has to be on this list. It's Grace by Jeff Buckley. I'm more of a fan of his father, Tim Buckley, but still, it's really sad that she died so young, and probably we would have gotten many great albums had he survived, but this is his best of his albums. I'm back again, had to change the battery of the camera. Where were we? We were at 31, Grace by Jeff Buckley. Number 30, Achtung Baby by U2. I kind of like pop. The album, this album is pretty much dismissed, pop. I think pop is good, but of course I can see that this is the better album in that style. Number 29 is probably, next to Be Here Now, the most controversial thing. With Be Here Now it was controversial that it even made the top 50, and the next album I think some people would have higher, maybe. Nevermind by Nirvana, of course, very important album, you know, kickstarted the guitar rock revolution in America, and it's a fine album, you know. Number 28, another musical revolution, but maybe on a smaller scale, Timeless by Goldie. That's, you know, that's electronic music, jungle, that's, you know, a very wild style of electronic music from England. Very good album. Next one, 27, again the electronic music genre. It's Daft Punk with Homework, their debut album. You know, includes great classics like Around the World or The Funk, so it's very good album. Number 26 is Vinyl. One moment. It's the second Björk album, Post. Fantastic album, of course. Next album is number 25, The Great Escape by Blur. Most people think it's a weaker version of Parklife. I don't think it's that much weaker than Parklife. I think both are very consistent albums and my two favorite Blur albums. Number 24, R.E.M. Automatic for the People. In my opinion, their best album. Number 23, Britpop again, Suede Coming Up. This was the first album they put out after their founding member and co-songwriter, the guitar player Bernard Butler, left the group, so many people at the time thought it will be hard for them without him, and they replaced him with a Suede fan, you know, who was like 17 or 18 years at the time, and it was just a Suede fan who could play all the guitar parts of Bernard Butler because he was such a big fan. But you know, with him they made this fantastic album. It's, you know, it's the most pop album and great hook lines, great choruses, you know, it's a fantastic Britpop album coming up as Suede. 22 is Bilingual, very Pet Shop Boys from 2 years before. Was probably the bigger album, more successful and more classics on it, but I always preferred this as an album, as an entity from 1995 or 6 it must be, I think 1996. This is really an album and you know, I enjoyed it. 21, one of the most underrated bands of the 90s, James from Manchester. They had several great albums in the 90s. Late is my favorite, not just of the 90s, but in general my favorite James album. It's their folky album, you know, usually they had more, you know, electric guitars and also danceable rhythms, but this is more like a folk album and, you know, incredible songwriting on that album. Number 20, we've just had The Great Escape, now it's time for Parklife, best Blur album, you know, no discussion about that in my opinion. Next is again Trip Hop from Bristol, Dummy by Portishead, fantastic album, great strings, you know, and puts you in a great mood. It's a very melancholic album and yeah, typical 90s music. Number 18, Blue Lines by Massive Attack, again Bristol, again trip hop. This is probably the album that started it all in the early 90s. Yeah, masterpiece. And also the next album is Britpop, and you know, Tricky was a guest star on this album, and this is Tricky. We've had him with Maxinque. This is the follow-up to Maxinque. This is Pre-Millennium Tension, my favorite Tricky album. Very paranoid, very dark, very moody. Not a very happy album, not a very joyous album, but when you're in the mood, you know, it's great. It's a bit like soundtrack to a horror film. Number 16, the big Oasis album, What's the Story, Morning Glory from 1995. Yeah, just watch my Oasis videos if you want to find out more about that. Number 15, I would have loved to give this place to Fold Your Hands, Child, You Walk Like a Peasant, my favorite Bell and Sebastian album, but that was released in 2000, so I have to go for my second favorite Bell and Sebastian album, If You're Feeling Sinister, from I think 1996 must be. It's the second album great. Number 13 is The Bands by Radiohead. You know, this was before Radiohead became that band that everybody, you know, you either had to love or to hate with Kid A or with OK Computer. You know, they became very different kind of band. This was when the last traditional guitar rock album with, you know, classic songs with verses and choruses and things like that. But the next album is the follow-up, which was the first, where they first tried to do more than just another pop or rock album. This is not as radical as Kid A and all the later albums would be, but this is like the bridge between the early guitar-based sound of Pablo Honey and the bands, and then the later sound. And in that sense, because it's that bridge that has the best parts of both sides, this is probably, of course, the best album. Number 11 is Ray of Light by Madonna. Yeah, next to Velvet Rope by Janet Jackson, this is the other pure mainstream pop album on the list, and this is one of the best mainstream pop albums of all time. Before we now are going to rank the top 10 best album of the 1990s, in my opinion, a few honourable mentions. You know, we've had Coming Up by Suede, but also the first two albums with Bernard Butler on guitar, Suede, you know, self-titled, and Dogman Star, great albums. But I decided, you know, there are bands like Oasis, which is my favorite band from the 90s, which will, as you already have seen, has more than one album in the list. But you know, with most bands, I decided to, you know, that one album should be enough for most bands. Paul McCartney's Flaming Pie is another one. K by Cooler Shaker is a great album. Pills, Frills and Belly Aches by Happy Mondays, I considered that, you know, that would have been like number 51 or 52 if I had to rank it. And also by Prince, or I think at the time he was called the artist formerly known as Prince, Emancipation, his bizarre, his crazy, not a triple album, I think it's a quadruple album, or, you know, I don't even know how many discs this album has, but it's you know, it's a wild album, you know, it's not consistent, it doesn't have, you know, not all the songs are great on that album, but to put out such a big album, you know, that deserves to be an honorable mentions. But now the top 10, those are all, you know, in my opinion, big masterpieces and albums I really like and I really still love to listen to at least once or twice a year. That those are the kind of albums I grew up with. Lots of memories with these albums. Number 10, Air, Moon Safari from France. Yeah, this is a wonderful album. It's like a, you know, this is the electronic music's version of a retro record. It's really, you know, it's influenced by people like Serge Gainsbourg and 60s and 70s artists, but it's also of its time. It's very I think 1998 was the year. It's a very 1998 kind of album. Number 9 is The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill by Lauryn Hill. Fantastic album. Is it more an R&B or more a hip hop album? You know, it's a bit of both. Fantastic album. Number 8, Garbage version 2.0. This is by far, in my opinion, their best album, and it's perfect. It's, you know, it's what Blondie would have made if they were young and in the 90s. Great choruses, great hook lines, great melodies, and you know, the sound architecture by Butch Vig and the other two producer guys in the group. It's really, it's also a very 1998 album. You know, this is also from 1998. Next album, the last vinyl, I think, for today. In that sense, my favorite hip hop album of the 90s and of all time. You know, by now you can tell I'm not a gangster rap fan or something. This is probably a bit lame to real hardcore hip hop fans, but this is the sort of pop hip hop that I enjoy or enjoyed the most. It's perfect album. The score by the Fugees. Number 6 is the not so well-known album by Goldie. We've had Timeless, which is considered his big masterpiece, but I love this album more. Saturn's Return. There's also Noel Gallagher on one song on guitar, but that's not the big thing about that album. The real big thing of this album is it's very long. It's a double album, and I think each of the CDs is like 70 minutes. Like the maximum amount of time you could have on a CD. And there's one song on that album is like 60 minutes long, and it's almost like an opera, like a symphony, an electronic symphony. It's genius. This is a genius album by genius. What's next? Number 5 is Hello Nasty by the Beastie. Okay, I said this core is my favorite hip hop album. Okay, this is my favorite hip hop album. Hello Nasty by the Beastie Boys. I think among Beastie Boys fans, it's not considered not even one of the 2 or 3 best albums. But I think this is such a colorful, varied album, very 90s. Taking influences from all sorts of different sounds and genres. There's hip hop songs, there's rock songs, punk songs, folk songs, reggae, funk, I mentioned funk, electronica. So it's a very eclectic album. The next album is probably the most eclectic album I've ever listened to, and it's the best eclectic album of all time. It's a bit, those are like relatives, I would say. Hello Nasty by the Beastie Boys and Odelay by Beck, which is also lots of hip hop things on there, but I wouldn't call it a hip hop album. It's like a collage of all sorts of styles. This is his best album. Number 3. Now the next 3 are I wouldn't say among my top 20 best albums of all time, but certainly top 50 best albums of all time. This is probably the best Britpop album ever made, best 90s Britpop album ever made. Different Class but Pulp. Each of the 12 songs is 10 out of 10. This is just incredible album. Number 2 is my favorite Björk album, Homogenic. Perfect album for winter. When it's cold outside, you can listen to this. This is really puts you in a great mood. Fantastic album. And I said my number 3 album is probably the best Britpop album of all time. But my number 1 album is my favorite Britpop album of all time. This is probably a top 20 of all time album for me. But it's not. I'm not sure if you even. It's not Britpop in the sense that different classes Britpop. This is more like a rock and roll album. This is one of my favorite rock and roll albums. The debut album by Oasis. Oasis in the 90s were to me the most important. In my life, the most important band, next to the Beatles. But the Beatles weren't. They weren't around in the 90s, so from bands that were happening at the time, Oasis were the most important. They really influenced me in all kinds of ways, and yeah, this is probably the album I've listened to most in my life. I don't think there's any other album in the world I've listened to more often. I haven't, in recent years I didn't, in recent years I haven't listened to it often. This is it's more like a youth thing. Oasis were a youth thing to me. Nowadays, maybe once a year we listen to it, but in the 90s, I listened to it basically once a week, sometimes even more often. So these were my top 50 favorite albums from the 90s. If you're into cool music and you don't know, you're not familiar with some of those albums, check them out. You won't. I won't say you won't be disappointed, but I would love to listen to all those albums for the first time, to have the chance to listen to them for the first time again.